The Master of Dragonstone had lived through 3 kings and 2 sieges, and he had learned that the world announced its catastrophes before delivering them. A raven's silence where there should be chatter, a tide running wrong against the wind. The particular way torchlight bent in a room where something had shifted in the invisible architecture of fate. He was not prepared for the sky to crack open like a wound. It came from the north-northwest, a pillar of light so violent it turned the Blackwater rush briefly silver and sent every gull between Dragonstone and the mainland wheeling skyward in shrieking panic. The thunder followed 3 heartbeats later, not the rolling grumble of a Westerosi storm, but something percussive and absolute, the sound of something vast being broken. The Meister dropped his quill. In the rookery above, every raven went silent at once. On the rocky shore below Dragonstone's sea gate, where black volcanic stone met the churning waters of Blackwater Bay, something had fallen from the sky. He was not dead. That much became clear quickly when the garrison's sergeant and 4 men-at-arms approached the crater with spears leveled and found the figure already rising from it. 6 feet and more of him, broad as a castle door, wrapped in red and silver armor that no Westerosi smith had ever designed, his hair long and golden where it wasn't singed, a short beard framing a face that would have made the most jaded court painter weep with professional jealousy. In one hand he held a hammer the sergeant would later emphasize in his report, as though that were the strangest detail. Short-handled and heavy-headed, and glowing faintly at its face with something that wasn't firelight. The stranger looked at the 4 spears pointed at him, and then he looked at the castle looming above, black and forbidding against a sky still crackling with dying electricity. And then he looked back at the spears. "I mean, you no harm," he said. His accent was like nothing any of them had ever heard. Not Westerosi, not the clipped vowels of Bravos, not the musical lilt of Dornish, or the rolling consonants of the Summer Islands. Something older somehow, and more certain of itself. "I am Thor Odinson, Prince of Asgard and God of Thunder. I require information about where I have landed, and then I require passage to speak with whoever rules this kingdom." The sergeant, to his lasting credit, kept his spear level. "You require," he repeated. "I do," Thor said, and not unkindly, "though I am willing to ask if that phrasing is more comfortable for you." The lightning above had not entirely dissipated. It moved between the remaining storm clouds in patterns that had no meteorological explanation, curling like smoke, like breath, like something alive. And 2 of the 4 men-at-arms took a quiet step backward. The sergeant, to his lasting shame, took 3. Word reached King's Landing by Raven within the hour. Word like that always traveled fast. The small council chamber smelled of tallow candles and old ambition when Tyrion Lannister read the message aloud, and he read it twice, because the first reading seemed medically implausible. A man had fallen from the sky in a pillar of lightning and landed on the shores of Dragonstone. He claimed to be a god. Why, he had created a crater in Westerosi bedrock by landing in it and then stood up. The hammer he carried had not left his hand despite 2 men-at-arms attempting to take it, and both of those men had reported feeling an overwhelming sense that the object had simply decided not to move, as though the hammer itself had opinions about being touched. "A god," Grand Maester Pycelle said, with the particular tone he reserved for things he found theologically inconvenient. "Preposterous." "The lightning was real enough," said Varys from his customary corner, his pale hands folded. "The garrison sergeant is not a man given to poetic embellishment. He describes it as, and I quote, like the sky was being torn apart from the inside." His words, not some bard's. "A faceless man," Cersei said. Her green eyes had gone very still, the way they always did when she was deciding something. "Or an assassin with a pyromancer's toys." "A pyromancer's toys don't leave craters in volcanic rock," Tyrion said. He set the raven's message down on the table and looked at it for a moment, the way a man looks at a piece of a puzzle that shouldn't fit but clearly does. "Someone extraordinary has landed on our shores. The question worth asking, the only question worth asking, given that our shores happen to include a heavily contested empty castle, is whether he knows where he is or whether he arrived accidentally." Why does that matter? Cersei asked. Because if he came here deliberately, someone sent him. And if someone sent him, we need to know who has that capacity. Tyrion picked up his wine. And if he arrived by accident, then he's confused, possibly frightened, and desperately in need of someone to explain the local customs before he does something irreversible out of ignorance. He is a man who fell out of the sky, Tyrion. He is not. He is a man who fell out of the sky, Tyrion agreed, carrying a hammer that 4 men couldn't move, in a bolt of lightning that a maester who has studied weather for 40 years cannot explain. Those are facts. I find it useful to build from facts. He finished his wine. I recommend we invite him to King's Landing. Politely, with an escort large enough to seem respectful rather than threatening. Cersei considered this with a particular coldness she reserved for plans she hadn't thought of first. And if he refuses? Tyrion looked at the Raven's message again. Then he looked at his sister. Then we learned something important about him, he said. Either way. Across the Blackwater Bay, in the torch-lit Great Hall of Dragonstone, Thor Odinson sat in a chair that had been built for a Targaryen king and studied the carved dragon heads on the walls and thought about what he knew so far. He knew this world had lords and castles. He knew it had ravens as messengers, which suggested organized communication. He knew the men who'd met him on the shore had been afraid, but not without courage, which spoke well of them. He knew the castle above him was built for power and had been evacuated recently. The cold hearths and empty sconces told that story clearly enough. And he knew from the way the lightning still moved in the clouds outside the high windows that something in this world was listening to him. Something very old. Something that had not heard thunder like his in a very long time, if ever. The torches flickered, though there was no wind. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. All men must die, but legends endure. He would need allies here. He would need information. And he would need, he suspected, to learn some lessons about this world that would not be comfortable. Because no world that built its halls from volcanic stone and carved its furniture into the shapes of weapons had ever been a comfortable world to learn in. Thor set Mjolnir on the table beside him. It landed with a sound like a judge's gavel. Outside, the storm moved slowly south toward King's Landing, as if following him. The escort Cersei sent was 40 men in Lannister crimson, which Tyrion had argued down from 200 on the grounds that 200 soldiers approaching a man who'd survived falling from the sky would communicate precisely the wrong message. 40 was respectful. 200 was an invitation to demonstrate exactly how little 200 soldiers mattered. He'd also insisted on going himself, which Cersei had opposed with the particular venom she reserved for his good ideas. The galley crossed Blackwater Bay in gray morning light, and Tyrion stood at the prow and thought carefully about what he was sailing toward. The Raven updates from Dragonstone's skeleton garrison had continued through the night. The stranger had eaten enough for 3 men, slept 4 hours, risen before dawn, went and spent the early morning walking the castle's battlements in apparent contemplation, Mjolnir in hand, occasionally stopping to look north with an expression the garrison sergeant described, somewhat helplessly, as worried. Not threatening, not calculating, worried, as though something beyond the horizon was troubling him. Tyrion found that detail more interesting than any other. A man who'd just fallen into an unknown world and was already looking north, toward the wall, toward whatever moved beyond it, was either prescient, paranoid, or had already somehow grasped what most lords in King's Landing spent their entire political careers deliberately ignoring. The galley docked at Dragonstone's sea gate as the sun broke through the clouds. In and Tyrion walked the serpentine steps up to the castle with 40 Lannister soldiers behind him, and the particular sensation in his chest that preceded either the best or worst moments of his life. The great hall doors were open. Thor was standing in the courtyard. He was larger than the Raven reports had suggested. Raven reports always compressed things, stripped the texture and mass out of reality, and flattened it into scratched letters on parchment. In person, the god of thunder occupied space the way dragons occupied space, with a physical authority that went beyond mere size. The armor caught the morning light and did something complicated with it. Mjolnir hung from his belt, seemingly relaxed, though Tyrion had the irrational impression that the hammer was paying close attention. Thor looked at the 40 soldiers. Then he looked at Tyrion. Something shifted in his expression. A recalibration, quick and intelligent. The look of a man who had just identified which person in a group was actually worth speaking to. "You are not a soldier," Thor said. "Tyrion Lannister. I am the Queen's hand." He paused. "Acting hand. The position has been somewhat turbulent lately." He tilted his head. "You're bigger than I expected, though I'm not certain what I expected. Something smaller, perhaps. Less real." "I am quite real," Thor said without particular defensiveness. He studied Tyrion with the focused attention of someone gathering information, cataloging details, weighing significance, building a picture. "Tyrion Lannister, you are the Queen's counselor, and you came yourself, and rather than sending only soldiers. I find soldiers are rarely useful for conversations." "I find that as well." Thor glanced at the 40 men-at-arms behind Tyrion, who were maintaining their formation with admirable discipline and visible discomfort. "You may tell them to stand at ease. I have no quarrel with Lannister men." "Generous of you. I do not pick quarrels with people who have not earned them." His blue eyes returned to Tyrion. "In my experience, that distinguishes me from most rulers." Tyrion smiled, genuinely, which surprised him. "Sit down, Lord Thor. There is much to discuss." "Prince Thor," he corrected mildly, "though I hold the title loosely. Asgard is somewhat far away at present." They sat in the great hall, at the long stone table carved with dragon reliefs, while Dragonstone groaned quietly around them in the morning wind off the bay. Tyrion poured wine, slid a cup toward his guest, and watched with interest as Thor drank it without ceremony or suspicion, which told him something. A man afraid of poison didn't drink offered wine. A man with legitimate reasons to believe he couldn't be poisoned did. "Asgard," Tyrion said, "I have read extensively. I am not familiar with it." "You would not be. It existed, beyond the reach of your world's charts." Thor set the cup down. "I was transported here by accident. A dimensional bridge, a means of traveling between worlds, was damaged in battle. I have no current means of return." "Trapped, then?" "Temporarily displaced," Thor said, with a precision that suggested he was not allowing himself to think of it as trapped. "When I need to understand this world, its powers, its threats." He paused. "When I walked the battlements this morning, I looked north. There is something in that direction that troubles me." Tyrion went still. "What did you see?" "I did not see anything. I felt something." Thor's jaw tightened slightly. "I have fought creatures of cold and death before. In my world, we call them frost giants, ancient enemies, creatures of ice who existed before warmth had its proper dominion over the world. What lies beyond that great northern structure, the wall I have heard your men call it, carries an echo of that feeling." He looked at Tyrion directly. "What is beyond your wall?" The great hall was very quiet. Torchlight moved in the draught. Tyrion picked up his wine and turned it slowly in his hands. He thought about the Night's Watch reports that the small council filed away unread. He thought about Jon Snow's letters from the Lord Commander that were received politely and acted upon never. He thought about what it meant that a man who had fallen from the sky less than a day ago, who had no context for Westerosi politics or history, who should by all rights be focused entirely on his immediate survival, was asking about the wall. "Officially," Tyrion said carefully, "beyond the wall there are wildlings, free folk, barbarous men who rejected the king's authority 10,000 years ago and have been raiding ever since." Thor waited. "Unofficially," Tyrion continued, and this was not something he said aloud in King's Landing, where the walls listened with Varys' ears, "there are things that the Night's Watch calls White Walkers, ancient creatures, commanders of the dead." He paused. "Most lords consider it mythology, a convenient story to justify the Night's Watch's funding." "And you?" Tyrion looked at the carved dragons on the walls, at the cold hearths, at the empty throne room beyond the hall's far arch, where a mad king's son had once plotted fire and blood conquest and called it destiny. "I think," he said slowly, that most lords who dismiss things as mythology do so because believing in them is inconvenient, and inconvenience has never once in the history of this world caused a threat to stop being real. He met Thor's eyes. I think the Night's Watch is afraid, and frightened men do not typically lie about what frightens them, only about how frightened they are. Thor nodded, a single grave acknowledgement, and the nod of a man filing information away in a mind that organized threats by priority rather than politics. Then you have a war coming, he said simply. We have several, Tyrion said. The question is always which one will kill us first. Outside, a raven landed on the battlements and folded its wings. Somewhere in the rookery, another raven waited with a message bearing Cersei's seal. Instructions Tyrion had not yet read. Plans already in motion that his journey here had been intended to delay. The queen did not send her hand to negotiate. She sent him to assess, while she positioned pieces on the board that her hand was not yet aware of. 40 Lannister soldiers stood in the courtyard, and in the great hall the god of thunder and the imp of Casterly Rock looked at each other across a dragon-carved table, and both of them understood. With a particular clarity that intelligent men recognize in each other, that this conversation was the most significant either of them had yet had on this particular morning. The hammer sat between them. It had not moved. But it was, Tyrion could have sworn, listening. Cersei Lannister had not survived 38 years in a world that viewed her as a possession. First her father's, then her husband's, then her son's, by underestimating variables. She had survived by converting them. Every threat became leverage. Every unknown became an asset once properly understood and properly caged. Robert had been a variable. Ned Stark had been a variable. Even Tyrion, for all his cleverness, was a variable she had learned to account for, to route around, to use without him realizing he was being used. The golden man who had fallen from the sky was a variable. She intended to convert him. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, which was how Cersei preferred her plans. The complexity was in the execution, not the concept. Thor would be brought to King's Landing as an honored guest. He would be housed in the Tower of the Hand, which had excellent acoustics for eavesdropping and only 3 exits, all of them monitored. He would be introduced to the court as a visiting dignitary from a distant land. She'd already asked Pycelle to draft something suitably vague about the further reaches of the Jade Sea. He would be celebrated, which was the most effective form of captivity Cersei had ever devised, because men who were being celebrated rarely noticed the bars. And then, once she understood what he could do, she would find the mechanism that controlled him. Every man had one. Her father had his legacy. Robert had had his wine and his wars. Renly had had his vanity. Ned Stark, gods help him, had had his honor. The most reliable mechanism of all, because honor could be used against a man with mathematical precision once you identified what he considered honorable. You simply placed his honor in opposition to his survival and watched him choose wrong, every time, until the choice killed him. She would find Thor's mechanism. She simply needed him close enough to study. He arrived in King's Landing on the 3rd day, riding through the city gates on a horse that seemed faintly offended by the assignment. Surrounded by Lannister escort and accompanied by Tyrion, who had spent the journey back from Dragonstone being more communicative with their guests than Cersei had instructed. She'd review that particular failure later. For now, she watched from a high window as the gates opened and the golden stranger rode into the capital of the 7 kingdoms. The small folk had gathered. They always gathered. King's Landing's population had an almost geological instinct for accumulating at significant moments, pressing itself into the streets around whatever event promised to become a story. They gathered now in numbers that surprised her. Word had traveled faster than she'd anticipated. Stories of lightning and craters, and a man who couldn't be disarmed had apparently moved through the city's taverns and dockside gossip networks at a speed that made ravens look sluggish. They were not afraid of him, and that surprised her more than the numbers. King's Landing's small folk had learned fear well and practiced it constantly. They feared the gold cloaks, feared the Lannisters, feared the Kingsguard's white cloaks, feared the faith militants' increasing boldness in the city streets. They had a finely calibrated relationship with danger that expressed itself as careful silence and deliberate invisibility. They were not silent now. They were watching with an intensity that was not quite reverence and not quite hope, but lived in the uncomfortable territory between them. The place where desperate people looked at something extraordinary and thought, perhaps. Thor seemed to feel it. He looked at the crowd, actually looked, not the practiced half-attention of a lord acknowledging subjects, and something in his expression shifted, a recognition, a weight. He had been looked at like that before, Cersei realized. He knew what it meant, and it troubled him. Men who were troubled by hope were more complicated than men motivated by ambition. Ambition she could work with. Trouble was messier. The throne room reception was staged with Lannister precision, banners correctly placed, candles at their most flattering angle, Joffrey on the Iron Throne in his best crown, with instructions to say as little as possible and look regal. The court assembled in its full hierarchy of brocade and calculation, every lord and lady present performing their careful political positioning. Varys stood to the left in his customary spot, hands folded, face pleasant, eyes cataloging everything. Littlefinger stood slightly apart from the cluster of minor lords, wearing a smile that Cersei had never fully trusted. Thor walked into the throne room and looked at the Iron Throne. He looked at it for a long moment, long enough that the court's practiced murmur of reception faded into uncertain silence. His expression was difficult to read. Not awe, not ambition. Something more considered than either. 1,000 sword, he said, not quite to anyone, melted and reforged. 8,000, Tyrion said from beside him. Give or take, the history of the realm in metalwork. It is not comfortable, Joffrey said from atop it, with the particular petulance of someone who had just realized they were not the most significant presence in the room. It's not meant to be. A king should not sit easily. Thor looked at Joffrey, just looked, it with those unsettling blue eyes that seemed to assess rather than simply observe. Joffrey, who made men flinch as a hobby and had never in his life encountered a gaze he couldn't make uncomfortable by royal proximity, shifted slightly on his throne. A king, Thor said carefully, should sit with justice. The discomfort of the seat is a philosophy, not a feature, if I understand the intent correctly. The court was very quiet. Cersei moved before the silence could solidify into something inconvenient. Lord Thor, you honor us with your presence. Westeros offers you the hospitality of the crown. She descended the steps with practiced grace, offering her hand. I am Cersei of House Lannister, Queen Regent of the Seven Kingdoms. Thor took her hand, not to kiss it, as Westerosi custom demanded, but to clasp it as an equal would. Firm, me brief. His eyes met hers without the particular quality of male assessment she was accustomed to. The inventory that most men performed without knowing they were performing it. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the Iron Throne, considering, reading the thing behind the surface. My lady, he said, I thank you for the hospitality. I will not abuse it. That last sentence was not a pleasantry. It was a quiet declaration, something with the quality of a boundary politely announced, the way a man states terms before terms need stating. Cersei heard it with perfect clarity and filed it behind her eyes where she kept things she would need later. He knew he was being managed then, or at minimum suspected it. That evening in the Tower of the Hand, Qyburn visited under the pretense of providing a medical examination. Protocol, he said, for all foreign visitors, simply to ensure their health was adequately supported during their stay. Thor declined politely. When Qyburn persisted with quiet professional insistence, Thor held up a hand and said also quietly, I understand what you are. He did not elaborate. He didn't need to. Qyburn left with his instruments unused and reported to Cersei that their guest was perceptive in ways that medical explanations would not adequately cover. Cersei sat in her chambers and looked at the city from her window. The torchlight of King's Landing spread below her like a field of dying stars. Somewhere in its streets, small folk were already building a story around the golden man who'd arrived at the gates. She could feel it the way she felt shifts in political weather. Order through the particular atmospheric pressure of a narrative gaining momentum. They would make him into something. They always did, with extraordinary men. They had made Robert into a legend, and Ned Stark into a martyr, and Joffrey into a monster. They would make Thor into whatever their desperation required. She poured wine and thought about mechanisms. Every man had one. She simply hadn't found his yet. Outside the Tower of the Hand, lightning moved between the clouds. Quiet, without thunder, as though something was thinking. The High Sparrow found Thor at dawn. This was not accidental. The High Sparrow did nothing accidentally. His entire philosophy was constructed around the idea that accident was what happened to people who hadn't submitted themselves fully enough to the god's purpose. And he had submitted himself so completely that he had ceased to experience coincidence altogether. He moved through King's Landing with the particular authority of a man who had decided that poverty was a weapon and righteousness was armor. And both of these decisions had proven to the considerable alarm of queens and kings alike entirely correct. He came to the Tower of the Hand in the gray pre-dawn, alone, wearing his plain rough spun and his bare feet on the cold stone. And he found Thor on the tower's upper balcony, watching the city breathe itself awake below. The fishmonger's carts, the baker's first smoke, the gold cloaks changing watch with the mechanical tiredness of men who learned not to think about what they were guarding. "You did not sleep," the High Sparrow said. It was not a question. "I sleep rarely," Thor said, without turning. "4 hours suffices. I have had 4. He glanced sideways at the old man in rough cloth and bare feet and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You are not a lord." "I am less than a lord and more than a king," the High Sparrow said pleasantly. "I am a servant of the 7. "Gods," Thor said. The word carried a complicated freight. "You have 7. We have 7 faces of the one divine truth." The old man moved to the balcony railing and looked out over the city with the satisfied expression of a man surveying something he owned without having purchased it. The father, the mother, the warrior, the smith, the maiden, the crone, the stranger. He paused. The stranger is the face of death, the unknown, the thing that comes from outside the familiar world. Thor turned to look at him fully now. "Ari, I thought that would interest you," the High Sparrow said. "You came here to tell me I am the stranger made flesh," Thor said. His tone was not hostile, but it had an edge to it. The edge of a man who had been told what he was by religious authorities before and found the experience consistently presumptuous. "That my arrival is divine purpose." "I came here," the High Sparrow said, "to ask you a question." He folded his hands inside his rough-spun sleeves. "Do you believe in gods?" The silence that followed had weight. Below them, King's Landing continued its morning assembly. Carts and voices, and the distant cry of a harbor seal, indifferent to the conversation happening above it. "I am the son of Odin," Thor said finally, "all-father of Asgard. I have sat at my father's table and drunk with beings whose age makes your Seven's mythology look like last week's news." He looked at the old man steadily. "I know what gods are. I know what they are not. The distance between those two facts is where most religion lives." The High Sparrow was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "A man who has truly known power rarely worships it. He fears it or respects it." He tilted his head. "Which do you do?" It was, Thor acknowledged privately, a better question than he'd expected. Before he could answer it, Melisandre arrived. She came up the tower stairs with the Red Priestess's characteristic quality of arrival. Not entering a space so much as igniting it, her crimson robes the only warm color in the gray morning, her ruby choker catching light that shouldn't have been sufficient to catch it. So she stopped in the doorway to the balcony and looked at Thor with eyes that had seen things in flames that she was still translating into language. The High Sparrow turned to look at her with an expression of mild theological distaste. The faith of the 7 and the Lord of Light had a relationship that could most charitably be described as competitive. "You should not be in King's Landing," he said to her. "The Lord of Light goes where his purpose requires," she said, without looking at the old man. Her eyes remained on Thor. "I came from Dragonstone. I was there when the lightning came." She stepped onto the balcony, and Thor noticed that she moved around the High Sparrow with the careful geometry of someone avoiding contamination. "I saw you in the flames 3 days before you arrived. A golden warrior falling from fire into ice, is standing between the dead and the living. Everyone seems very certain about what I am, Thor said. I am certain of what I saw, Melisandre said. In the flames, certainty is not interpretation. It is sight. She moved closer, studying him with that particular quality of religious intensity that Thor recognized across all cultural contexts, the look of absolute conviction that had started more wars than any army. You are Azor Ahai reborn, the prince who was promised. You were forged in light and tempered in loss, and you carry the weapon that will end the long night. She looked at Mjolnir. Thor followed her gaze to the hammer at his belt. He thought about what Mjolnir was, its history, its making, the mountain of sacrifice in dwarven craft, and Odin's intention that had gone into its creation. He thought about Atri's forge and the dying star and what it had cost. It was not forged to end anyone's long night, he said. It was forged to protect. In the Lord of Light's purpose, Melisandre said, those are the same thing. They are not the same thing, Thor said, with a quiet firmness that stopped her. Protection and ending are philosophically distinct. The distinction matters enormously in practice. He looked at her with the patience of a man who'd had this argument in some form on 7 different worlds. I respect what you believe you saw. I do not accept being conscripted by it. The High Sparrow made a sound that might, in a less disciplined man, have been a laugh. Melisandre's eyes narrowed. In her ruby, a flame moved. She had been wrong before, about Stannis, about the Shadow, and about the leeches and their kings. And each wrongness had cost something she hadn't fully accounted for until she was counting the receipts. But she had not been wrong about the flames showing her something real. The interpretation was where error lived, not the vision. She looked at Thor again, with the recalibrating attention of a woman updating her theology in real time. The flames showed me your arrival, she said more carefully now. They showed me lightning and death and a golden light standing against the cold. What that means? She paused, and this pause cost her something. Thor could see it, the concession of a woman who'd traded in certainty so long that uncertainty felt like bleeding. What that means may be more complex than a single name. Most true things are, Thor said. The High Sparrow looked between them with the expression of a man watching 2 foreign armies negotiate on his territory. The 7 do not speak in flames, he said finally. They speak in the hearts of the faithful and the suffering of the poor. Whatever this man is, he is flesh and will, not prophecy and fire. He looked at Thor with those mild, ancient eyes. The question I asked you remains unanswered. Thor looked out over King's Landing. The morning had fully arrived now, the sun burning the gray off the bay, the city in its full noise and smell and teeming, contradictory life. He thought about Asgard, its golden halls, its absolute hierarchies. He thought about his father, who was a god, and what being a god had actually meant in practice. The weight of it, the loneliness of it, in the way power at sufficient scale stopped feeling like power and started feeling like responsibility with no exit. I do not worship power, he said at last, answering the High Sparrow's question. I carry it. There is a difference that I have spent a very long time learning. He turned from the railing. And I respect those who serve something larger than themselves, regardless of what name they give that something. He looked at both of them, the High Sparrow in his rough-spun certainty, Melisandre in her crimson fire. But I will not be defined by either of your frameworks, he said. I am Thor Odinson. I am here by accident, and I will leave when I can. What I do between those 2 moments is my own. He went inside. On the balcony, the High Sparrow and the Red Woman stood in morning light and looked at each other with the complicated mutual recognition of 2 people who had both just encountered something that refused to be a symbol and found the experience equally disorienting. In Melisandre's ruby, the flame moved again. It showed her something she hadn't seen before. Not a warrior standing against the cold. A warrior choosing to. The Raven from Riverrun arrived on a Tuesday, which meant nothing to Thor and everything to Tyrion, who received it in his solar with the particular expression he wore when good news arrived wrapped in catastrophic implications. He read it twice, set it down, read it once more, and then went to find his guest. Thor was in the training yard. This had become a pattern over the 4 days since his arrival. Dawn conversation with whoever sought him out. Morning hours in the yard working through forms with Mjolnir, that the gold cloaks watched from the walls with the focused attention of men professionally committed to threat assessment. The hammer moved in his hands with a liquid ease that had no business belonging to something that weighed what it weighed, tracing patterns in the air that left brief, luminous after-images, like the memory of lightning written in daylight. Sir Meryn Trant had watched from the gate on the second morning and then walked away without comment, which from Sir Meryn constituted a significant review. Tyrion watched for a moment before speaking. "I've had a raven from the young wolf," he said. Thor lowered Mjolnir. "Robb Stark. You've been doing your reading. Your maester has an excellent library. House Stark, Winterfell, the North, the Warden's family." Thor turned to face him. "He is at war with your family. He is at war with the Iron Throne, which my family currently occupies, which amounts to the same thing, yes." Tyrion settled onto a practice bench with the careful arrangement of a man whose legs didn't reach the ground comfortably. "He's requesting a parley, not with Cersei. She wouldn't agree, and he knows it. With me." He paused. "He's heard about you." "How?" "Word travels in Westeros at a speed that has always exceeded the ravens carrying it. The small folk talk, merchants talk, spies, and there are always spies, talk." Tyrion looked at the hammer. A golden man who fell from the sky and could not be disarmed and spoke to the Queen Regent as an equal. That story has legs. He met Thor's eyes. "Robb Stark wants to know if the crown has acquired a weapon." "I am not a weapon," Thor said. "No, but in Westeros, everything extraordinary is assessed first as a weapon and second as everything else. It's a cultural reflex. We've been doing it for 8,000 years. Tyrion tilted his head. "He's camped at Riverrun with what remains of his northern army. He's lost the phrase. He's losing the political war, even where he's winning the military one. He's 20 years old and carrying the weight of every Stark death on shoulders that were never meant for it." He paused. "He is, as far as I can assess from everything I know about him, an honest man trying to fight an honest war in a world specifically designed to punish both of those qualities." Thor was quiet for a moment. "You want me to go," he said. "I want you to consider going. There's a distinction." Tyrion picked up a practice sword from the rack beside him and turned it in his hands without any intention of using it. "Cersei doesn't know about this raven. If she did, she'd burn it and arrest the maester who received it and add another strand to the web she's building around you that you haven't fully noticed yet." He set the sword down. "I am telling you about it because I think you should make this choice yourself, with full information, rather than having it made for you by my sister's management of your guest quarters." Thor looked at him with that assessing quality, the gaze that seemed to measure not just what was said, but the architecture of intention behind it. "Why do you help me?" he asked. It was a direct question, asked without accusation but with genuine curiosity. "You are a Lannister. Your family's position depends on the crown's strength. Giving me information your sister doesn't want me to have weakens that position." Tyrion smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd made peace with a complicated truth long ago. "I am a Lannister who has spent his entire life watching my family's strength build on foundations that crack under moral weight. I have a gift for identifying lost causes. I also have a gift for identifying men who might, as in specific circumstances, be worth the considerable personal risk of being honest with." He stood, smoothing his doublet. "You asked me on our first meeting what lay beyond the wall, not what lay south, not who held the throne. North. That told me something." The training yard was quiet around them. A raven crossed the sky above the yard's open top, black against pale morning blue. "I will go," Thor said. Getting out of King's Landing unobserved required Tyrion's complete attention and the cooperation of a dock worker whose brother owed Tyrion a favor of the financial variety, and they were on a boat heading upriver before the morning watch changed. Cersei would know by noon. By then it wouldn't matter. Riverrun was 3 days hard riding from where the river would take them, and Thor spent the journey in the boat's prow, so watching the riverbanks of the Riverlands unspool, burnt farmsteads, abandoned villages, the particular landscape of a land that had been used as a battlefield by armies whose lords lived elsewhere. He said little, Tyrion, who was not accustomed to comfortable silences, found himself respecting this one. Robb Stark met them at Riverrun's gates himself. This surprised Thor, who had developed, over 5 days in King's Landing, an accurate instinct for the gap between Westerosi lords' stated values and their practiced ones. He'd expected an audience chamber, a throne, the theatrical architecture of power that Cersei deployed as naturally as breathing. Instead, there was a young man, barely a man, really, with the kind of face that hadn't yet learned to hide what it was thinking. In riding leathers and a gray cloak, gray-eyed and serious, Shores with a massive direwolf sitting at his heel like a second conscience. Grey Wind looked at Thor and did not growl. That, Robb noticed. His eyes moved from the wolf to the stranger with a quick intelligence that reminded Thor, painfully, of someone. The shape of the assessment, the moral weight behind the eyes. It reminded him of Steve Rogers. He filed that thought away carefully, in the place where he kept things that made this displacement harder than it needed to be. "Lord Thor," Robb said, "I thank you for coming." "Prince Thor," Tyrion said from beside him. "He's particular about it. I've learned to respect the particularity." Robb almost smiled. Almost. "Prince Thor, I'll not keep you with ceremony. I want to know one thing." He looked at Thor directly, and with the blunt northern honesty that Tyrion had described on the river, and that Thor now saw was not performance, but simply the way this young man was built. "Are you the Lannister crown's man?" Thor met his eyes. "I am no one's man," he said. "I am a guest in your world by accident and an ally to no faction by obligation. I came because Tyrion Lannister told me the truth about your situation, which is more than most people in King's Landing have managed." Robb absorbed this. He looked at Tyrion. "First honest thing anyone said to me in months," Robb said, "is that the imp told this man the truth." "I find honesty strategically underrated," Tyrion said. "It's so unexpected in my family that it functions almost as a disguise." They went inside. The War Council was small. Robb kept it that way, another northern instinct, not the understanding that large councils were where plans went to leak. Edmure Tully sat uncomfortable at his own table. The Blackfish stood against the wall with his arms crossed and his eyes sharp. A master hovered near the ravens. Robb spread his maps and spoke plainly. The Freys were gone. The Karstark betrayal had cost him a third of his northern lords. He held the military advantage in the field and was losing the political war in the halls. And now winter, real winter, the North's oldest truth, was pressing south, and his men who'd been away from home for 2 years were looking at the gray sky with eyes that understood what that gray meant in a way that southern lords simply didn't. Thor listened to all of it. Then he looked at the map, at the vast empty space north of Winterfell, beyond the wall's thin line, and said, "Tell me about your brother, the one at the wall." Robb looked up sharply. "Jon," he said, and something in his voice changed. Younger, raw. "Jon's at the wall, He stopped. "Why?" "Because," Thor said quietly, "whatever is happening in this war will not matter if what lies beyond that wall reaches your armies first. And I believe it is closer than your councils are telling you." The Blackfish straightened against the wall. Grey Wind raised his head and looked north. Outside Riverrun's walls, the wind had shifted. It was coming from the north now, and it was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the season. The mountain came to Riverrun 3 days after Thor arrived. Not Gregor Clegane himself. He was in the field, burning what remained of the Riverlands with the systematic thoroughness of a man who had confused destruction with purpose. But his reputation came, carried in the mouths of refugees who arrived at Riverrun's gates in a straggling, hollow-eyed procession that told the story of what the Lannisters' most useful monster had been doing to the small folk between battles. Thor listened to a woman describe what had happened to her village with the focused stillness of a man committing testimony to permanent memory. And when she finished, he sat quietly for a long moment, while the great hall's torches moved in the draft. Then he asked Robb Stark where Gregor Clegane was. Robb looked at him carefully. 3 leagues south. He's moving toward a Tully-held mill, strategic choke point on the river supply line. He paused. "Why?" "Because someone should stop him," Thor said simply. And the conversation we've been having suggests that your forces engaging him directly costs you men you cannot replace, while he absorbs losses without strategic consequence, because Lannister gold replaces soldiers faster than the North produces them. He stood. I am not replaceable by Lannister gold. You'd go alone? The Blackfish said from the wall. He said it the way a man says something he already knows the answer to but needs confirmed for the record. I would go efficiently, Thor said. Alone is efficient. Robb studied him for a long moment, that searching northern gaze, looking for the angle, the hidden cost, the thing underneath the offer. He'd been betrayed enough times in the past year that trust had become a thing he approached the way you approached a fire, for warmth, but carefully, and never with your back to it. What do you want in return? He asked. Information, Thor said. About the wall, about your brother, about what your northerners know of what moves beyond it that your southern allies do not. He met Robb's eyes. I am not fighting your war, Lord Stark. I am fighting the thing behind your war that no one in this room, except possibly your wolf, has fully reckoned with yet. Grey Wind at the word wolf looked up and held Thor's gaze for 3 steady seconds. Then he lay his great head back on his paws with the resolution of a creature that had reached a verdict. Robb watched his wolf. Then he looked at Thor. 3 leagues south, he said. There's a ford on the Red Fork. He'll cross it before midday. Thor went. He flew, which the Riverland small folk who witnessed it would describe in varying levels of theological crisis for years afterward. The golden man rising from the riverbank on a column of crackling air, Mjolnir extended, moving across the gray morning sky at a speed that birds recognized as categorically different from bird flight, and responded to by landing immediately and becoming very still. He covered 3 leagues in minutes and found the mountains column, 200 men in Lannister crimson with the scorched remnants of a farmstead behind them and a mill ahead, fording the Red Fork with the unhurried confidence of an army that had not yet encountered anything capable of inconveniencing it. Gregor Clegane was visible before he was identifiable. His size preceded him the way a storm's pressure preceded lightning, the surrounding soldiers giving him a natural radius of empty space that was part deference and part self-preservation. 8 feet of armored muscle on a horse that looked exhausted by the assignment, his helm like a castle in miniature, moving through the river shallows with the absolute physical authority of something that had learned early that the world rearranged itself around mass if the mass was sufficiently committed. Thor landed on the far bank. 200 men stopped moving. Gregor Clegane stopped his horse. The silence was of the particular quality that occurs when 2 objects of significant force recognize each other across a distance, and the air between them understands what is about to happen. There are villages behind you that are burning, Thor said, at a volume that carried across the ford without requiring him to shout. There are people dead in them who were not soldiers. I am asking you to turn your column around and return to wherever Lannister gold keeps you housed, and I am asking you once clearly, so that afterwards there is no ambiguity about whether the request was made. The mountain looked at him for a very long moment. Then he drew his sword, a 6-foot length of Westerosi steel that most men couldn't lift from the ground, let alone wield, and urged his horse forward into the shallows. What followed lasted 4 minutes. It would be described differently by every one of the 200 men who witnessed it, because human perception under conditions of extreme stress tends toward the personal and the partial. No 2 soldiers standing in that ford had precisely the same angle or the same threshold for what their minds would accept as real. But the consistent elements across all 200 accounts, cross-referenced by the maester who spent 3 weeks collecting them at Robb's instruction, were as follows. The Golden Man did not move from the bank. The lightning came from a clear sky. The sword shattered. Not bent, not knocked aside. Shattered. The steel fragments catching the gray morning light as they scattered across the ford in a radius that the maester estimated at 30 feet, though some accounts put it higher. The mountain's horse made a sound that horses were not generally known to make and relocated itself to the far bank through what appeared to be an act of pure self-interested will. Gregor Clegane stood in the shallows without his sword and looked at the Golden Man on the bank. Thor walked into the ford. The water came to his knees and he moved through it without adjusting his pace, and when he reached the mountain he stopped and looked up. because even Thor needed to look up slightly, and said quietly enough that only Clegane heard it. You are not the worst thing in this world, but you are practicing to become it. I have seen what the worst thing looks like, and I am telling you, as a professional courtesy, to stop. He hit the mountain with Mjolnir once, pulled, significantly pulled. Thor had spent the walk across the ford calculating the precise differential between what would kill and what would not, running the arithmetic of Asgardian force against Westerosi physiology with the experience of someone who'd had to solve that equation on multiple worlds with multiple species. Gregor Clegane left the surface of the ford in a low arc, cleared the bank by 6 feet, and landed in a Riverlands field with an impact that left a depression in the earth and a silence in which every bird within a quarter-mile reconsidered its position. He was breathing. Thor had been careful about that. He turned to face the 200 soldiers in the ford. Your commander will recover, he said. He will tell Lannister leadership what happened here. That is intentional. He looked at them, not with threat exactly, but with a quality that threat aspired to. I am asking each of you to consider, individually and honestly, what you are doing in the Riverlands and whether it is something you wish to continue. I am not going to stop all of you. I am telling you that I could. He paused. That is also intentional. He flew back to Riverrun. Robb Stark received the report with an expression that moved through several distinct phases. Disbelief, recalibration, a kind of reluctant exhilaration, and then something more complicated that settled behind his gray eyes like a stone dropping to a river bottom. You left him alive, he said. I left him as a message, Thor said. Dead men carry nothing. A man who can report accurately what happened is more useful to the larger purpose than a martyr whose story gets edited by whoever finds him. Robb was quiet. The candle between them threw shadows across the map of the Riverlands. So much that my father would have liked you, he said finally, quietly. Not as a pleasantry, as something that cost him something to say. Thor looked at the young king across the table, at the weight he carried that was too large for his frame, at the honor that was, in this world, a structural weakness that every scheming lord in Westeros was quietly working to exploit. Your father, Thor said carefully, was by every account a man who understood that doing right and surviving doing right were different skills. He mastered the first. This world did not give him time to master the second. Robb's jaw tightened. No, he said. It didn't. Outside, the wind was still from the north. Gray winds sat at the door and faced it, nose working at something the air carried that human senses couldn't parse. The candle flame bent south as if pushed. And in the field outside Riverrun's walls, among the Stark bannermen's cook fires and worn tents, a story was already spreading, passed between soldiers in the low voice that men used for things that felt too significant for normal volume. About a golden man who had gone to meet the mountain and come back alone. He hadn't come back empty-handed, though. He'd come back with something harder to quantify than a victory. He'd come back having demonstrated, in a world that was systematically teaching everyone in it, that power without conscience was the only power that worked, that the premise was not necessarily correct. The soldiers weren't sure what to do with that, but they were thinking about it. Littlefinger arrived at Riverrun on a Tuesday. He arrived as he always arrived everywhere, winged slightly before he was expected, and through a door that hadn't been the obvious one. In this case, a river trader's barge that docked at Riverrun's Watergate with a cargo manifest listing salted fish and wool, which was accurate and which also happened to contain, in a small cabin below decks, Peter Baelish and 2 of his quieter associates. He was shown to a guest chamber by a steward who didn't know who he was, which was exactly how Littlefinger preferred to enter situations he intended to control. He sent a note to Thor before he sent one to anyone else. Thor read it in the early morning, sitting at the window of his own guest chamber with the note held in fingers that could bend Valyrian steel and chose not to bend parchment, reading the careful handwriting 3 times with the thoroughness he applied to everything that arrived unexpectedly. Lord Thor, I know who you are, what you can do, and what you need. I also know 3 things about this world that no one else in Riverrun will tell you. Meet me at the Watergate at dawn. Come alone. PB. He went. Of course he went. A man who claimed to know what Thor needed and offered three specific pieces of information was either genuinely useful or specifically dangerous, and both categories warranted investigation. He brought Mjolnir and said nothing to Tyrion, which he suspected Tyrion would forgive, and Tyrion would also have predicted. Littlefinger was waiting at the watergate in the pearl gray pre-dawn, sitting on a dock post with his hands in his sleeves and his mockingbird pin, catching the first light off the river, wearing the expression of a man who was entirely comfortable being the most interesting person in any given location, and had learned to make that comfort work for him. He looked at Thor for a long moment with the frank assessment of someone who had made his career out of correctly appraising things that other people undervalued. "You're real," he said. "I'd half convinced myself the reports were exaggerated." "Reports usually are," Thor said, "in both directions." "In this case," Littlefinger said, "they weren't. If anything, they were conservative." He stood unhurriedly and tilted his head slightly. "You hit the mountain with a hammer and he flew. The soldiers in the ford are still discussing whether they witnessed a miracle or a military demonstration." "I intended it as both," Thor said. Littlefinger's eyes sharpened with something adjacent to delight, the expression of a man who just confirmed a hypothesis. "Yes, I thought so." He gestured along the dock. "Walk with me." They walked along the Watergate's dock in the early light, the red fork moving dark and cold beside them, carrying the Riverland's autumn leaves in slow procession toward the sea. "The three things," Thor said. "Patience," Littlefinger said pleasantly. "Context first, or the things won't land correctly." He clasped his hands behind his back. "I am Peter Baelish, Lord of Harrenhal, Lord Paramount of the Riverlands, Master of Coin until recently, and currently the most comprehensively informed person in the Seven Kingdoms, which is a title I've awarded myself, but which is nonetheless accurate." He glanced sideways at Thor. "I know who holds power, who wants power, and, most usefully, who thinks they hold power when they have actually been holding what I've allowed them to hold. The distinction is where I live." "You are describing yourself as the man behind events," Thor said. "I am describing myself as the man who understands that power is not a possession. It's a current." Littlefinger's voice had the quality of a man sharing a genuine philosophical conviction that also happened to serve his interests perfectly. "Chaos isn't a pit. Chaos is a ladder. Most men, lords, kings, gods apparently, look at chaos and see danger. I look at it and see elevation." Thor looked at him steadily. "You engineered chaos. I cultivated it. There's a craft distinction." Littlefinger smiled. "I didn't come here to confess. I came here because you represent a variable I haven't previously encountered, and I make it a practice never to leave significant variables unaddressed." He stopped walking. The river moved beside them. "The three things." He held up a finger. "1. Cersei is not managing you. She believes she is. She has Qyburn watching the Tower of the Hand's access points, and Varys watching Qyburn, and both of them watching you. What she doesn't know is that Varys is also watching her, and that I have a source inside Varys's network who is watching Varys." He paused. "While she intends to use your reputation, the story of the mountain at the ford is already traveling south, to consolidate her position against Stannis, who is preparing a naval approach on King's Landing. She wants you as a weapon for the Blackwater. She has not yet decided whether to ask or compel." Thor said nothing. Filed it. Second finger. 2. Robb Stark is going to the Twins. Littlefinger's voice went carefully neutral, the neutrality of a man reading from a script he'd written and was rather proud of. "He needs the Frey crossing. He's going to make peace with Walder Frey and attend a wedding. He believes the negotiation is going well." He paused. "It is not going well." Thor turned to look at him fully. "What is happening at the Twins?" he said. The quality of his voice had changed. Something colder in it. The voice of a man who had learned the hard way that civilized-sounding sentences delivered in pleasant settings were sometimes the container for the most irreversible information. "A lesson," Littlefinger said, "the one this world teaches most reliably. That guest right is sacred until it isn't, and that when it isn't, the men who break it are usually the ones who plan the meal." He met Thor's eyes without flinching. I know this because I helped arrange certain preliminary conditions. The Iron Throne needed the Stark threat neutralized. I provided a mechanism. The dock was very quiet. The river moved. You are telling me you have arranged for Robb Stark's death, Thor said. I am telling you, Littlefinger said, with the precision of a man who understood exactly how his words would be processed, that I have arranged for a situation that will have that outcome among others unless a significant variable intervenes in the next 48 hours. He tilted his head. You are a significant variable. Thor studied him. The man before him was extraordinary in his own way, not powerful in any physical sense, not armored against anything a weapon could do, standing on a dock in the early morning making this confession with the composed manner of someone reporting a weather forecast. The courage of that, or the arrogance, or whatever the correct word was for the quality that made a man stand before a god and describe his own villainy as though it were a business proposal. Thor had encountered many kinds of bravery across many worlds. He wasn't sure he'd encountered exactly this kind before. Why are you telling me? He said. Because, Littlefinger said, I have spent 20 years playing a game with pieces I can predict. You are a piece I cannot predict, which means you are either the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to my position or the most useful. I prefer to know which before circumstances decide for me. He reached into his sleeve and produced a small folded map. The twins, he said. The wedding is in 2 days. The Frey forces will seal the castle at the feast. The Stark bannermen outside the walls will be attacked simultaneously by Lannister forces that arrived last week under the guise of a trading column. He offered the map. If Robb Stark dies at the Twins, the Northern cause dies with him. The war ends in Lannister victory. Cersei consolidates. Stannis retreats. And the Iron Throne's attention, all of it, turns south and east, away from the wall, where the real threat is gathering without anyone in power caring enough to look. Thor took the map. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Littlefinger with the particular expression he wore when he was deciding what category a person belonged in. Not enemy, not ally, not the simple moral binaries that Westerosi politics seem to actively select against. You want me to stop the Red Wedding, he said. I want to see what you do, Littlefinger said. There's a difference. He smiled, and the smile was the most honest thing about him, because it didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. I told you chaos is a ladder. You, Lord Thor, are currently the tallest rung I've ever seen. He walked back along the dock and disappeared through the watergate. Thor stood alone in the early light with a map in his hand and 48 hours and the knowledge settling into him with the weight of Mjolnir on a bad day, that this world's worst moments were not accidents. They were managed. He went to find Tyrion. Tyrion received the information about the twins with the expression of a man who had suspected something and deeply wished he'd been wrong. He sat in his guest chamber at Riverrun with Littlefinger's map spread on the table between them and a cup of wine he wasn't drinking, and the particular stillness that came over him when his mind was moving faster than his face wanted to show. Thor watched him process it, the quick eyes moving across the map, the slight tension around his jaw, the way his fingers settled flat on the table as if pressing down on something that wanted to rise. Or the Red Wedding, Tyrion said finally. His voice was very quiet. That is not what it's called, Thor said. It will be. Tyrion looked up. If it happens, that's what it will be called, because that's the kind of world this is. It names its atrocities after the sacred things they violated, so that everyone who hears the name understands exactly what was broken. He picked up the wine, looked at it, set it down again. Guessed right. You eat a man's bread and salt, you are protected under his roof. It is the oldest law in Westeros. Older than the Iron Throne. Older than the Seven Kingdoms. His jaw tightened. If Walder Frey breaks it, he intends to, Thor said. Littlefinger was clear. Littlefinger is always clear, Tyrion said, with a bitterness that had history in it. He is the clearest man I have ever met. But he sees everything exactly as it is, and uses that clarity to make everything worse in ways that serve only himself. He stood, moving to the window. The red fork glittered below. He told you this because he wants to see what you'll do. You understand that. I understood it while he was still talking, Thor said. It doesn't change what needs to be done. No, Tyrion agreed. It doesn't. He was quiet for a moment. If you go to the twins, you're choosing a side. Explicitly. Openly. You will no longer be an ambiguous variable that Cersei can theoretically point in any direction. You will be the man who saved the king in the north from a Lannister-sanctioned plot. He turned from the window. Cersei will not forgive it. Tywin will not ignore it. And Littlefinger, whatever Littlefinger's actual purpose is in telling you, will use the political consequence of your choice in ways neither of us can fully map right now. I know, Thor said, and you're going anyway. A young man who fights with honesty in a world designed to punish it is going to be killed at a dinner table, Thor said. His pregnant wife is going to be killed beside him. His mother, his bannerman. He looked at Tyrion steadily. I have the ability to prevent it. The calculation that produces do not go requires me to weight political consequence above the lives of people who have done nothing to deserve what is coming. That is not a calculation I am capable of making. Tyrion looked at him for a long moment. You know, he said, I have met a great many men who claim to operate from principle. Most of them meant they'd identified a principle that conveniently aligned with their interests and were using it as justification. He picked up his wine and finally drank. You're irritatingly genuine. I've been told. It will get you killed in this world. Many things have tried, Thor said. They left Riverrun before midday. Thor, Tyrion, and a raven sent ahead to warn Robb Stark under a coded message that Tyrion composed with the swift efficiency of a man who'd spent his life writing things that couldn't be written plainly. Robb received it 2 hours before his column was due to depart for the twins. And the conversation that followed between the young wolf and the god of thunder in Riverrun's small council chamber was brief and direct in the northern way. How certain is this? Robb asked. Certain enough that the man who arranged it told me himself, Thor said, as a demonstration. Robb's gray eyes were very still. My mother warned me about the phrase, about this wedding. He looked at his hands on the table. Young man's hands, scarred from a year of real war. I dismissed her concern. I thought the political necessity outweighed. He stopped. It doesn't matter what I thought. It matters, Thor said, because understanding the mechanism that nearly killed you is how you avoid the next one. And what is the mechanism? Your honor, Thor said quietly, not unkindly. Every honorable thing you've done in this war has been used against you. Your vow to the phrase, broken for love, and that breaking became the lever they used. Your mercy to prisoners became reputation for weakness among the lords who respect only ruthlessness. Your straightforwardness in negotiation became predictability that your enemies mapped and exploited. He held Robb's gaze. Your honor is real. I am not asking you to abandon it. I am asking you to understand that in this world, honor requires strategy to survive, or it becomes only a monument to good intentions. Robb absorbed this with the particular expression of someone receiving a truth that confirmed a fear they'd been refusing to name. My father didn't survive it, he said. No, Thor said. He didn't. They rode for the twins. Thor flew ahead, arriving at the Frey castle as the sun began its descent. Landing on the bridge between the Frey twins' towers with a crack of thunder that brought every guard on every wall to full attention simultaneously. He did not attempt subtlety. Subtlety in this particular situation was not the appropriate instrument. He wanted Walder Frey to know he was here before Robb Stark arrived. He wanted the old man to recalculate. Walder Frey received him in the Great Hall with the suspicious hospitality of a man whose plan had just encountered an unforeseen complication and was deciding in real time whether to adapt or abandon. He was ancient and sharp-eyed and smelled of grievance. A man who'd spent 90 years cataloging every slight and storing them with the patient industry of someone who fully intended to collect. He looked at Thor with eyes that had seen too much Westerosi history to be easily impressed, and were nonetheless currently impressed against their will. The man who knocked over the mountain, Walder Frey said, from his chair at the hall's high end, surrounded by sons and grandsons and the general atmosphere of a family that had long ago stopped liking each other. Come to attend a wedding, have you? I've come, Thor said, standing in the center of the Frey hall, with Mjolnir at his belt and the full attention of every armed man in the room, to attend a wedding and to make the nature of my attendance clear. He looked around the hall. at the Frey sons, at the crossbowmen visible in the gallery above, positioned with a casualness that was not casual. At the tapestries along the walls behind which, he noted, while certain shapes suggested men who were not tapestries. I know what this hall was prepared for, he said, at a volume calibrated to reach every corner. I know the arrangement. I know the signal. I know the forces outside the walls. He returned his gaze to Walder Frey. I am informing you, Lord Frey, as clearly as I am capable of informing anyone, that guest right will be honored tonight, not because you have chosen to honor it, because I am here and I will be here through the feast, and any man who raises a weapon against a guest in this hall will answer for it before he has time to explain his reasoning. The hall was absolutely silent. Walder Frey looked at him with those 90 years of accumulated cunning and resentment. He doing the mathematics that very old men do when they encounter situations that require new calculations. Weighing the Lannister arrangement against the golden man standing in his hall, who had knocked Gregor Clegane into a field and come back discussing philosophy. You'd make an enemy of the Iron Throne, the old man said. The Iron Throne, Thor said, has been making enemies for considerably longer than I've been in this world, and seems to manage the consequences adequately. He tilted his head. Lord Frey, I am not asking you to abandon your grievances with House Stark. I am asking you to resolve them through means that do not require killing people who have eaten at your table. The former is between you and the young wolf. The latter is between you and me. He let that distinction land. Robb Stark arrived at the twins at dusk, and riding across the bridge with his bannermen and his young queen and his mother's careful eyes reading the situation with the experienced wariness of a woman who'd been reading Westerosi situations her entire life. Catelyn Tully looked at Thor standing at the gate, and something shifted in her expression. Relief and fear arriving simultaneously, the particular mixture that came from danger being present, but perhaps, possibly, controllable. The feast began. The musicians played, the wine moved, the Frey daughters paraded. Walder Frey sat in his chair and watched Thor with the calculating attention of a man storing information about an obstacle for future reference. The signal never came. In the gallery above, the crossbowmen stayed still. Behind the tapestries, nothing moved. Mjolnir sat at Thor's belt through the entire feast, and every man in the hall was aware of it the way you were aware of a banked fire in a small room. Not threatening exactly, but definitional. The room organized itself around its presence, without anyone acknowledging they were doing it. Afterward, when the Stark column had crossed back safely and camped in the fields beyond Freyland, Catelyn Stark found Thor at the riverbank and stood beside him in the dark for a long moment before speaking. You knew, she said, before you arrived. Yes. How? Someone told me, he said. Someone who wanted to see what I would do with the information. She was quiet. The river moved. Somewhere in the camp behind them, a fire popped and a soldier laughed at something. In this world, Catelyn said finally, men who are told things are usually told them for a reason that serves the teller. Yes, Thor said. And you went anyway. The reason someone tells you a truth, Thor said, doesn't change whether the truth requires acting on. He looked at the river. Your son is alive. Your bannermen are alive. The mechanism that was going to kill them is still in place and will look for another opportunity. But tonight, they are alive. Catelyn Stark looked at the river beside him. Valar Morghulis, she said quietly. All men must die. Not tonight, Thor said. The fire in the camp threw long shadows across the field, and somewhere to the north, beyond the horizon, beyond the wall, something cold moved through the dark without hurry. It had waited thousands of years. It could wait a little longer. The raven from the wall arrived at Robb Stark's camp 11 days after the twins. It came in the night, which ravens rarely did. They were daylight birds, creatures of practical navigation, and a raven flying in darkness meant the hand that sent it had not waited for dawn because dawn felt like a luxury it could not afford. The Night's Watch maester who had written it had not used the formal opening that ravens customarily carried. He had written 3 sentences, and the third was the one that mattered. The dead walk in numbers beyond counting. Hardhome is lost. The Night King comes south. Robb read it by torchlight, with Thor and Tyrion and Catelyn standing around him, and the War Council's usual noise. The argument about supply lines, the disagreement about the Lannister troop movements near Ashford, the ongoing complicated negotiation about what the Greyjoy fleet was doing in the West, died completely, the way sound died in a room when something entered it that made all previous sound feel irrelevant. Grey Wind raised his head and faced north. Hardhome, Thor said. What is Hardhome? A wildling settlement, Tyrion said carefully. Beyond the wall, north of the wall, a significant population. Thousands of free folk who hadn't made it south before the snows came. He paused. If the dead walk there in numbers beyond counting, and the Night King moves south? The wall, Thor said. The wall has held for 8,000 years, Robb said. But he said it the way men said things they needed to be true rather than things they believed were true. And everyone in the room heard the difference. The wall is ice and old magic, Thor said. Oh, I have been feeling the old magic since I arrived. It is substantial. But I have also been feeling what presses against it from the other side, and that has been growing. He looked at the Raven's message in Robb's hand. I need to go north. You need, Catelyn began. I need to see it, Thor said. Not from reports, not from ravens. I need to understand what the Night King is, what his army is capable of, what tools exist to fight it, and what I can contribute that changes the outcome. He looked around the room, at Robb's gray eyes, at Tyrion's careful assessment, at Catelyn's controlled fear. Everything we have been doing in this war, the battles, the politics, the schemes and counter-schemes, is meaningful. I do not dismiss it, but it is meaningful only if there is a world left to resolve it in. If the wall falls, then it doesn't matter who sits the Iron Throne, Tyrion said quietly. He said it like a man who'd known this for a long time and hadn't said it aloud because saying it aloud in King's Landing was a form of political suicide. I've thought about this. I've been trying not to, because thinking about it when you're surrounded by people who've decided not to think about it is a uniquely isolating experience. But yes, if the dead come south in numbers that overran Hardhome, the living's internal conflicts become somewhat academic. Robb looked at the Raven's message. Then he looked at Thor. Go, he said. Go and come back and tell me what you see. Tell me what it requires. He paused, and something resolved in his expression. The young wolf finding under the political and military weight of a war he was losing. Carry the same stubborn northern directness that had gotten his father killed, and would not, Robb had apparently decided, stop being the correct approach regardless of the cost. The North remembers, all of it, including what lives in the dark beyond the wall. Thor went north. He flew through 2 days and a night, crossing the neck, crossing the vast white expanse of the north, the landscape below him shifting from the patchwork browns and grays of a kingdom at war to the absolute white silence of a winter that had no interest in human politics. Winterfell passed beneath him, empty, he noted, its towers dark, a wound in the landscape where something had burned. And then the land continued north into a cold that even Asgardian physiology noted and respected. The wall appeared at dawn. It was larger than the reports had prepared him for. Reports always failed with things of sufficient scale. They described dimensions that the mind received as numbers and converted to mental images that were always, inevitably, smaller than the reality. 300 miles long and 700 feet tall, the largest structure in the known world. Ancient ice that shone blue-white in the early light, with the particular luminosity of things that had been old for so long, they'd developed their own quality of age. He felt the magic in it from a mile away. A ward so deep and complex that it predated anything he'd encountered outside of Asgardian construction. Something that had been built with intent and sacrifice, and a fundamental understanding of what it was keeping out. He landed on the wall's southern top and stood there for a moment in the wind. Castle Black lay below, its buildings small against the wall's base. The land to the south was white and still. The land to the north was white and still, and also wrong. The wrongness, subtle at first, a quality of the air, a silence that was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of presence. The difference between a room that was empty and a room in which something stood very quietly. He flew north. He found Hardhome from 20 miles away, not by sight but by smell, carried on the north wind with the clinical directness of a message. He had smelled battlefields on many worlds. This was not that. This was older, colder, the smell of death organized rather than scattered. Death with direction. Hardhome was a ruin. The settlement itself was barely visible under what had been done to it. The structures collapsed or burned, with a shore where wildling boats had once landed, now a gray expanse of churned snow, and the evidence of sudden violent ends. But the ruin was not what stopped Thor's breath when he arrived. The army was. He hovered above it in the morning cold and looked down at what had been assembled in the days since the raven was sent, and he made himself look at all of it. Not the part of it that was manageable, not the section of it that fell within previous experience, but all of it, the full extent, the horizon-reaching columns of the dead moving south in a silence that was absolute and organized and patient with the patience of things that no longer had anything to wait for. Hundreds of thousands. He had fought armies. He had fought frost giants, Chitauri, dark elves, the forces that Thanos assembled across 2 decades of systematic preparation. He understood scale. He understood what it meant when a force exceeded a certain threshold of number and became something different in character from what mere quantity suggested. Became a condition rather than an army, a weather event rather than a military action. This was that threshold. He descended. The whites responded to his approach with the alien attention of things that had no individual awareness. A collective turning, a mass reorientation, the way iron filings moved around a magnet. They did not fear him. They had no mechanism for fear. They registered him as a warm thing in a cold landscape and organized themselves accordingly. The lightning came when the first wave reached him. It was not the pulled, calibrated lightning he had used at the ford with Gregor Clegane. There was no arithmetic of restrained force here, no calculation of what would wound without killing, no mercy differential applied to the living. These were not the living. They moved and they functioned and they attacked with the terrible coordinated efficiency of a system operating at design specification. But they were not alive in any sense that required him to moderate what he did to them. The lightning moved through them in chains, one to the next, conducting through the dead in crackling blue-white arcs that left silence in their wake, because what the lightning touched stopped moving. He moved through the army the way a storm moved through a forest, not meeting it, but being it, Mjolnir clearing space in every direction, the thunder of his passage audible, he would later learn from Castle Black's southern towers. He found the Night King at the army's center. He was standing on a rise of frozen ground above the main column, watching Thor's approach with the absolute stillness of something that had no nervous system to quicken, no adrenaline response to what was coming, no biological machinery of anticipation or fear. He was tall, taller than a man, with the particular proportions of something that had been constructed rather than born, ancient blue eyes and a face that the children of the forest had made into a weapon thousands of years ago. He looked at Thor with intelligence. Real, cold intelligence. Not the dead thing directional response of his army, but something older and more considered. The look of an entity that had been observing the world it was ending for 8,000 years and had developed, through that observation, when something that was not wisdom, but was its equivalent. The cold understanding of something that had existed long enough to stop being surprised by anything. Thor landed before him in the snow. They looked at each other. "I know what you are," Thor said. "I have fought the cold before. I have fought death before. I have fought beings older than your wall and more powerful than your army, and I will tell you what I told all of them. I am willing to stop." The Night King looked at him. He raised one hand. The dead surged. And Thor understood in the moment before the wave reached him the crucial distinction between all the enemies he had previously faced and the one before him now. The others had wanted something. Conquest, survival, revenge, power, to prove a point to a universe that had hurt them. Want was a mechanism. A want could be negotiated with, redirected, used against itself. The Night King did not want. He ended. There was no mechanism in him for any outcome other than the one he'd been made for. The children of the forest had built him too well. They had created in him something so perfectly committed to its function that 8,000 years of existence hadn't introduced a single deviation. The lightning tore through the dead in waves, and they kept coming and kept coming, and Thor moved through them with everything he had. Not restrained, not calibrated, but fully in the way that he rarely allowed himself to be fully, because the world usually required him to leave something standing after he was done. Dragonglass shattered under his feet as he moved, a cache of it left by some Night's Watch expedition years ago. When now scattered across the frozen ground, and where the dragonglass touched the dead, they stopped with a finality that was different from the lightning stopping. He noted this with the part of his mind that ran tactical assessment in parallel with action, filed it as critical information. The Night King watched. He raised both arms. The fallen dead began to rise again. Those the lightning had stopped, those beyond the immediate radius, the entire Hardhome ruin behind him, everything he had already moved through reanimating in the Night King's wake with the casual ease of a man flipping cards. Thor hit the Night King with Mjolnir. It connected, not deflected, not absorbed, not stopped by some impossible supernatural defense, but connected. Asgardian force meeting the Night King's chest and sending him backward across the frozen rise in a way that his army immediately registered, a collective disturbance moving through hundreds of thousands of dead like a tremor through water. The Night King rose. He looked at Thor. He looked at his own chest, where the Mjolnir's impact had done something. Not destroyed, not wounded in any human sense, but registered, which was more than anything in 8,000 years had managed. Something moved behind those ancient blue eyes. Not fear, not pain, but something adjacent to interest, the recalibration of an intelligence that had just received genuinely new information. He turned. He walked north. His army followed, not in retreat, nothing so human as retreat, but with the patience of a tide pulling back from a shore it intended to return to. They moved north in their terrible organized silence, and within 20 minutes the plain around Hardhome was empty of everything except the dead who would not rise again and the dragonglass scattered across the frozen ground. Thor stood in the wreckage and the wind and the cold. He breathed. He looked north at the retreating army until it was gone beyond the horizon. Then he looked at his hand, at Mjolnir, which was humming at a frequency he'd never felt from it before, as though it too had registered something new, as though it had found in the Night King something that it recognized from deep in its own dwarven forged memory, something that went back further than Thor's history with the hammer, something ancient meeting something ancient. He filed the sensation away. Then he flew south toward Castle Black, where Jon Snow was standing on the wall's southern edge, watching him return through the dawn with an expression that was equal parts desperate relief and the particular look of a man whose every worst fear has just been confirmed in the most spectacular way imaginable, which paradoxically makes the confirmation almost a comfort, because at least the fear had been real, at least the night had not been invented. Thor landed beside him. "The wall will not hold forever," Thor said. "No," Jon said. "Dragonglass stops them. Valyrian steel stops them. Lightning stops them, temporarily, but they can be raised again." He looked at Jon directly. "The Night King cannot be stopped by conventional force. He requires something specific. I don't know yet what it is." "You hit him," Jon said. There was something in his voice, not awe exactly, but recognition, the sound of a man cataloging a data point he desperately needed. "You actually hit him." "He felt it," Thor said. "He left." "He left," Jon repeated. He turned to look north. The wall's edge fell away into the white landscape below them, vast and cold and patient. "He's never left before. Every previous encounter, he left because he learned something," Thor said. "Not because he was beaten. I want you to understand the distinction before we plan anything around what I just did." Jon turned to look at him. Gray eyes, stark eyes, with something behind them that Thor had been trying to identify since he'd seen the name in Robb's family history. And only now, standing next to the man, he resolved, It was the look of someone who had died and come back, the particular quality that resurrection left in a person's gaze, a distance that was not coldness, but was the permanent knowledge that the world continued past the point where you were in it. Thor recognized it. He'd seen it in the mirror, after certain battles. "You've died," Thor said. Jon looked at him sharply. "I have," he said, carefully. "So have I," Thor said. "Twice." He looked north. It changes your relationship with what you're fighting. When you know that death is not the end of the question, only the end of one answer, it becomes, he paused, finding the word, clarifying. Jon was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved across the wall's top. "He'll come back," Jon said. "Yes." "With everything?" "Yes." "Then we need dragons," Jon said. "Not as a fantasy. As a tactical assessment, clean and direct as a sword. We need Daenerys." Thor looked at him. "Tell me about Daenerys," he said. Jon Snow's account of Daenerys Targaryen took an hour, delivered in the Night's Watch's sparse briefing room below the wall with a fire that both of them sat too close to in the way that men did after serious cold. And Thor listened to all of it with the focused attention he reserved for information that would determine everything that came after. He listened to the dragons, their names, their sizes, the difference between Drogon's black enormity and the lost blue fire of Viserion, now moving somewhere in the Night King's army as a weapon pointed at the very wall it had once helped defend. He listened to Daenerys herself, the liberation of Slaver's Bay, the burning of the Khals, the crucified masters and the freed unsullied, and the Dothraki horde that had crossed the narrow sea in ships because a silver-haired woman had walked into fire and walked out with dragons, and the sea between them had eventually seemed less significant than the fire. He listened to Jon's voice when it described her, the careful neutrality of a man who had strong feelings he was professionally committed to not displaying, the flatness of someone controlling something that wanted to move. He listened to what she had done to King's Landing. That part Jon delivered differently, not the controlled recitation of military facts, but with the halting quality of someone describing something that had not yet finished becoming language, something still too raw to have settled into the grammar of past events, the bells, the people in the streets, the dragon fire that did not distinguish between Lannister soldier and smallfolk child, the city that had survived the Mad King and the War of Five Kings and Cersei's wildfire, and the long night itself, only to burn in the end at the hands of its liberator. Thor was quiet for a long time after Jon finished. "You killed her," he said. Not as accusation, as confirmation. "Yes," Jon said, "because of the city. Because of what came next if I didn't," Jon said. He said it the way a man said the thing he'd said to himself 10,000 times, testing it, checking it for cracks, finding the same answer every time, and taking no comfort from the consistency. She wouldn't have stopped. King's Landing was the beginning, not the end. She said it herself. She would liberate every city and every kingdom by whatever means liberation required. He looked at the fire. She believed it. That's what made it. She genuinely believed she was saving the world. She may have been right about what needed saving, Thor said. Wrong about the method. Yes, Jon looked at him. You've seen that before. I've lived adjacent to it, Thor said carefully. Power of sufficient scale, wielded by someone who is genuinely convinced of their righteousness, is one of the most dangerous forces in any world. Not because they are wrong about their values, sometimes their values are correct, but because certainty at that scale stops receiving information that contradicts it. He paused. Yes, I have a brother who taught me that lesson. Jon absorbed this without asking the obvious questions. The northern reticence, the understanding that some things were offered as information rather than invitation. Bran is king, Jon said. Bran the Broken. He paused over the word, the stark inheritance of complicated family. My brother sits the Iron Throne. The long night is ended. The White Walkers are gone. He looked at the fire. All of that is true. And yet, Thor said, and yet Viserion is still out there, Jon said quietly. The Night King's death didn't. He stopped, reassembled. When Arya killed the Night King, the army of the dead collapsed. Every white, every White Walker, gone in an instant. But Viserion, we never found Viserion's body, the ice dragon. He went down beyond the wall when it fell, and we assumed. You assume the collapse took him with it, Thor said. Every living dead thing in the realm dropped the moment the Night King died, Jon said. There was no reason to believe Viserion would be different. Thor looked at the fire. He thought about the Night King's retreat at Hardhome. Not the retreat of something defeated, but of something learning. He thought about those ancient blue eyes processing the new information of Mjolnir's impact with the cold intelligence of an entity that had existed for 8,000 years. He thought about what an intelligence like that might have arranged in advance, what contingencies an 8,000-year-old mind might build into its design. What if Viserion was different, Thor said. What if the Night King built a contingency into the dragon's binding that the general collapse didn't reach? What if, he looked at Jon, the Night King felt Mjolnir. He left. He went north. What if he went to something he'd prepared? The fire cracked. Jon was very still. Viserion could melt the wall, Jon said. Could melt any wall. In the Night King's hands, an ice dragon breathing blue flame is not a dragon, Thor said. It's a weapon with wings. And a weapon doesn't require its maker to still be functional. It requires only its last instruction. They looked at each other across the fire. Outside Castle Black's walls, the night was absolute. No stars, the cloud cover that had moved in from the north 3 days ago and not moved since. The particular darkness that came before something significant in every world Thor had ever stood in. He had learned to read the darkness, not with Asgardian magic or the all-seeing eye or anything mythological, simply with the accumulated experience of a man who had stood before enough endings to recognize their specific quality of atmosphere. This darkness was not over. I need to go north again, Thor said. I'm coming, Jon said. There was no argument in it, no request for permission. The flat declarative of a man who had died and returned and met the Night King and lost a dragon and carried the weight of a mercy killing that the world had not yet decided how to judge, and who had arrived, through all of that, at the particular calm of someone who had been afraid of everything and come out the other side into something quieter and more durable. Thor looked at him. You understand what we may find, he said. I've understood it since the Raven came, Jon said. I've been waiting for someone to say it aloud. They went north at dawn, Jon on horseback, moving through the ruined gate that the wall's collapse had left in its aftermath, the great blocks of ancient ice now a rubble field through which the wind moved with nothing to impede it. Thor in the air above, covering wider ground, scanning the white landscape with eyes that had been trained across multiple worlds to find things that didn't want to be found. They found the signs at midday. Blue flame, not fire's orange warmth, not wildfire's acid green, but the blue-white of something between fire and ice, burning in the snow with the wrongness of cold heat, marking a trail that moved northeast in a line too deliberate to be natural. Something was moving, something large, something that left the ground beneath it dead in a way that was different from winter's ordinary killing. A dead that did not decay but preserved, the death of refrigeration, everything it touched becoming very still and very permanent. Viserion. They found him at the coast, the northernmost point, where the land gave out and the frozen sea began, a white expanse that stretched toward places no Westerosi map had named. He was lying on a promontory above the ice, enormous and wrong, the blue of his eyes where Targaryen fire had once lived, still for now, as if waiting. On his back, Noir carved into the ice of the promontory above him, something Thor recognized with a cold recognition that settled in his chest like Mjolnir on a downswing. Runes, not Westerosi runes, not the old tongue of the free folk or the carved geometries of the children of the forest, something older than any of those, something that predated Westeros's memory of itself and reached back into the world's fundamental language, the deep grammar of existence that only things of sufficient age could read. The Night King had known or suspected that something was coming to his world that could stop him. He had read it in the arrival, the lightning that the Weirwood network had transmitted through every heart tree in Westeros simultaneously. The drowned god's tide running wrong. The ancient wards of the wall resonating with something they recognized across the gap of ages. He had prepared accordingly. Thor read the runes. He read them with the education of an Asgardian prince whose father had built some of the first runes and whose tutors had included beings for whom language was older than stars. He read them and understood them, and stood there in the northern cold with the understanding settling into place around him, and the ice dragon breathing its cold below, and Jon Snow on his horse at the promontory's base, looking up with those gray knowing eyes. "What does it say?" Jon called. Thor looked down at him. "It says," he said carefully, "for the one who carries the storm, a trade, the dragon for the god." Jon was quiet. "He wants you," Jon said. "He wants to understand me," Thor said. "That's different. He learned something from Mjolnir, and he wants more of that knowledge. He wants to see if what I carry can be," he paused, "incorporated. Can it?" Thor looked at the runes again, at Viserion below, waiting with the patience of dead things, at the frozen sea beyond, stretching north toward wherever the Night King had retreated to rebuild what Arya Stark had unmade. The Night King was not gone. He was learning. 8,000 years of existence, and for the first time since the children of the forest had pushed the dragon glass into his chest, he had encountered something new. Thor had not beaten him. Thor had given him a problem, and an 8,000-year-old intelligence had responded the way all intelligence responded to genuinely new problems. By building a framework to address it. The framework was the runes. And the runes were an invitation. Thor looked at Mjolnir. He thought about what Littlefinger had said, about chaos as a ladder, about variables that couldn't be predicted being either the most dangerous or the most useful thing in any situation. He thought about what Tyrion had said, about power preserved rather than used becoming something different from power at all. He thought about Robb Stark's gray eyes and Catelyn's controlled fear, and the soldiers at the ford watching a man choose not to kill, and what that choice had put into them. He thought about what Jon had told him about Daenerys, the certainty that stopped receiving information, the righteous fire that didn't distinguish. He thought about his brother. He thought about all the things he'd learned in this world of ice and fire. This world that punished honor and rewarded cunning, and still, somehow, stubbornly, against all architectural evidence to the contrary, kept producing men and women who chose honor anyway. Robb Stark choosing it, Jon Snow choosing it, Ned Stark choosing it all the way to the block. A world that kept making honorable people and then killing them for it was not a world that had given up on honor. It was a world that needed it badly enough to keep trying. He looked at the runes one more time, then he looked at Jon Snow below. "Tell Bran," he said, "that the Night King is rebuilding. Tell him what I've told you about Viserion's binding and the runes and what I believe is happening north of here. Tell the king everything, and tell him to send whatever ravens are necessary to whoever has the knowledge to address it. The Citadel, with the remaining Red Priests, the children of the forest, if any still exist." "What are you going to do?" Jon asked. Thor looked north. "I am going to answer," he said, carefully. He flew down to the promontory, landing on the ice above Viserion, standing in the center of the Night King's carved runes with Mjolnir in his hand, and the northern wind tearing at his cape, and the frozen sea stretching in every direction around him, like a world that had decided on its conclusion, and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. He did not intend to let it. Below on the promontory's base, Jon Snow watched him for a long moment. Then he turned his horse south. He rode through the ruined wall gate without looking back, carrying everything Thor had told him toward a king who could see the past and a world that needed someone who could see the future. In Castle Black's rookery, ravens waited. In King's Landing, Tyrion Lannister sat in a small council chamber and read a report that made no sense and would require significant mental revision. In her Solar in Winterfell, Sansa Stark received a raven from her brother at the wall and read it 3 times with the careful attention of the North's most capable political mind, and then sat for a very long time looking at the window and thinking about what it meant that the world was not, as it had briefly appeared, finished. In the Riverlands, soldiers around cookfires told each other a story about a golden man and the mountain and what it meant when power chose not to kill. The story was growing. In the north, on the ice, thunder moved. In the weeks that followed, Westeros adjusted to the permanent presence of its first Asgardian, the way it adjusted to all significant variables, slowly politically, and with considerable disagreement about what it meant. Bran the Broken received Jon's report and looked at it with the three-eyed raven's particular quality of unsurprise, the expression of a man who had seen this in the Weirwood network and chosen not to mention it for reasons that the small council found, as they found most of Bran's reasons, simultaneously reassuring and deeply troubling. Tyrion drafted 7 different official positions on Thor's status before settling on a purposeful ambiguity that satisfied no one, which meant, in his estimation, that it was correct. Sansa's ravens went to the Citadel, to Ashai, or to every red temple still burning on the continent of Essos, seeking knowledge about what the Night King's runes meant and what an entity of Thor's nature represented in Westerosi cosmology. The answers that came back were incomplete and contradictory and fascinating. Beyond the wall in the permanent dark of the northern ice, a conversation was beginning between the storm and the cold. Not a negotiation, not a surrender, but the slow, dangerous, necessary process of 2 ancient forces determining what the other actually was. Westeros held its breath. Winter still came, but now it came towards something that stood in it.